Welcome back. This lecture is on moral foundations theory, which is a pluralist account of moral psychology by Graham and colleagues. So, when we say it's a pluralist account, I'm sort of contrasting it with the Gray and colleagues article you read, right, which had the moral dyad theory, right, that perception of harm is the basis of morality. Um, this is a theory of morality that posits several different templates, right? At least four or five. So, and that's the main, it, as we'll see, this theory actually kind of agrees on many levels with some of the other stuff we've seen from Haidt and from Gray. But the main bone of contention here is that they posit numerous moral templates. And they're more in agreement with Haidt, right, than with Gray. And they offer some new evidence for that we haven't seen so far too. So if you read the article, it covers some of the ground it covers is sort of familiar, right? But I think it's helpful to repeat this stuff. A lot of these folks agree with each other on many levels, but then they'll disagree on certain tenets, right? So moral foundations theory, here's some of its basic claims. So it is a nativist theory, and we've already seen something about nativism, right? Some arguments for moral nativism. So moral foundations theory, which is sort of a broader theory of moral psychology, claims that yes, there is an innate first draft of the moral mind. But it must be triggered by experience, just like, the innate language module posited by Chomsky needs to be triggered by experience. If it isn't, then you don't learn language. So experience is necessary, right, for morality to emerge. For example, uh, there's evidence that monkeys are hardwired to fear snakes, right? They've evolved, they have an innate mechanism to avoid snakes, but they have to be exposed to snakes at least once for that to be, for that innate mechanism to come online. And it only takes a single instant, right? So as opposed to, you can get them in the lab and sort of try to give them negative associations with flowers, right? And they won't develop an aversion to flowers. Expose them to a snake once, they have one bad snake experience, and that's it. They hate snakes. And it does seem like something like this. We've seen some of that evidence in child development that human infants do seem to be hardwired to prefer fairness, right? We saw some evidence for that, to prefer helpers as opposed to harmers and things like that. It's a nativist theory. Thinks morality is innate. Number two, culture. So we have this first draft of the moral mind that is innate, but then of course it is modified, right, and enhanced by culture. And, right, they kind of need to say that any good theory of morality is going to have to try to make sense of the wide variation we see in moral beliefs, right, across culture. So everyone shares the first draft of the moral mind, but that's going to be edited by the culture you're raised in. But they're going to say it can't be completely altered. Um, Different cultures might put more or less emphasis on things like, respect for elders, right? You might see slightly different practices, but they would claim probably that you will never see a culture that says murder is okay, right? And you should always steal or something like that. Going to be some basic level of similarity among cultures. Um, Number three, so like all the theories we've seen so far, intuitionist to moral psychology, which says that uh, our intuitions are sort of the first, right, impetus of our moral judgments, right? They begin as automatic, unconscious reactions, and then the rational part of morality comes afterwards, and it's sort of secondary. And then number four, it's a pluralist theory, right? So unlike Gray et al.'s, theory that harm is the basis, MFT says there are several basic moral templates. They should be familiar because Haidt talks about these ones too. So care and harm is one, right? But also there's fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and purity degradation. So they agree with Haidt on that point, disagree with Gray and colleagues. Um, so it's worth walking through. We haven't yet sort of gone through these different moral templates in much detail. And care and harm, we certainly have covered, right? So we judge that caring for other people is morally good. We judge that harming other people is morally bad. They have an evolutionary explanation for this, right? They say, well, this is because humans mature late, right? So, right, a human takes, but they don't mature, right? Their bodies don't mature until into their teens, right? At some point, compare this to like a puppy, right? That is, fully grown by 1 year of age, right? So humans take a long time to mature, and parents that are caring, right? That take care to prevent harm for their children and spend a lot of time with their children for a long time, um, their children are going to be more likely to survive and then continue to have children. The DNA is going to get down, so evolution is going to favor caring humans. Um, and this evolved character trait, you know, if you have it in you to be caring because it's good for your children, well, you're not going to be able to sort of stop that caring impulse. You're going to end up caring for non-offspring as well. Number two, the fairness cheating template, right? So we care about justice, not just harm, right? So even if someone is not harmed by an unfair distribution of money or whatever, right? Say we work together to build and then sell a house, right? And then you take your share of the money. Um, maybe I'm not harmed by it, right? Maybe you need the money more even, and I'll be fine or whatever. But still, we judge that as unfair and we judge it as wrong, right? Uh, so they posit an evolutionary explanation of that as well, which is that we are a social creature, right? And we form larger and larger social groups. And in a larger social group like that, there's a opportunity for free riders, right, to get in there and take advantage of sort of this caring, sharing uh, situation, but not give back, right, to not contribute, to take and not contribute. And so we need some mechanism for, right, reducing the amount of free riders. And the way we do that is we care a lot about cheating, even if it's not harmful, right? We say, oh, you broke the rules. The rules are important, right? It keeps our society together. Number three, loyalty and betrayal. So humans are tribal, right? We had to band together into groups in order to compete for resources, right? We're not as big and strong and tough as bears and lions. Um, so the effectiveness of humans, right, are one of our big evolutionary sort of when I say benefits, I don't know if benefits is the word, but um, we can band together, right, and cooperate to take down a large animal. You need cohesive groups, and so you have to be loyal to your group, right? That's the only way that works. So it's a slight that number three is slightly different than two. Both of them have to do right with the social aspect of humans. Um, Number three is sort of, I think, more focused on smaller groups, and it's less rule based and more about right relationships and loyalty and sticking up for each other. Number four, authority subversion. So certainly primate social groups, chimpanzees, right, our nearest ancestors, um, and the other apes, uh, hierarchical social groups, and this is probably the case with early humans as well. And so when you have that sort of social group, respect for authority important, right? So, right, chimps higher in the hierarchy. If another chimp steal, right, a higher up chimp's food or tries to mate with their mate or something, the punishments are very harsh, right? They will kill the other chimp, they will banish the other chimp, um, because if the cohesion of the social group depends on that hierarchy, then violations of that need to be punished severely. The idea is that this is extended into humans as well. Not so much in our current society, so much, right? In modern society, and this is, if you recall, this came up earlier that, our current society does not very much resemble these early human societies, right? Um, but that was taken to be evidence that these traits are evolved, right? If they're lagging behind, right, the current social situation because our with technology, right, our societies are developing at an exponential rate, right? Well, evolution works a lot more slowly, right? So if we have these slightly more primitive impulses, that suggests that perhaps they're innate and not learned, right? And number five, purity and degradation. So the evolutionary explanation for this is that we need to avoid germs. We have evolved instincts for avoiding, bad meat, rotten food, right? Or gross, even risky activities that could cause disease, potentially maybe risky sexual activity. Uh, and so that manifests in moral judgments against impure acts. Are there others? Maybe. They're open to there being other basic moral templates, right? Um, there have been other candidates put out there, and uh, the moral foundations theory says, yeah, maybe there's more, right? But there's certainly not less, right? There's certainly not one, like Gray et al. Claim. So, a little historic. So that's the basics of the moral foundations theory, right? They just laid out there right at the beginning, right? Here's our basic. Here's our, the moral foundations, the five that we think exist, right? Maybe more. So now they step back into a little historical context of where this theory came from, right? So it was a interdisciplinary sort of thing. So researching cultural anthropology, evolutionary psychology, and what would and the automaticity revolution in social psychology, which is this sort of dual process view of the mind that we've been talking about a lot. Um, all sort of came together, and they sort of like took the evidence from all these different fields and concocted this moral foundation theory. So they took from cultural anthropology um, was the idea that they recently, so in the past, right, studies of morality had been largely focused on Western culture, right? It had just been sort of assumed for some reason that you could get at morality by studying, undergraduates in the United States or infants in the United States, and people didn't really even think that there would be any point in seeing if things were different in India or China, right? Um, and you ended up with a couple different approaches. You had Kohlberg's account, which was on individual rights and fairness, sort of a Kantian kind of approach. And you had Gilligan's care ethics, which if you've ever studied or taken an ethics course, you probably would have heard of Gilligan and her sort of feminist approach to ethics. Um, both of those were sort of Western, or at least based on evidence from studies of Western cultures. Um, so Schwader decided to study other cultures and actually found much more variety in moral judgment. So, for example, his studies in India showed that concerns about individual rights and harm are cross-cultural, right? That shows up in India. But India, there is also a much greater uh, emphasis on your role in a social hierarchy and respect for the purity of your body. So those are two of the moral foundations, right? The respect for authority and purity violation ones. Uh, though it's if you study another culture, it's sort of much more apparent that those are as important moral foundations as harm, right? So that's where they got the idea that, oh yeah, we need to be more pluralistic, right? If you look at other cultures, it's much more clear that there's lots of different foundations for morality. So the automaticity revolution, right? So uh, this is the dual process theory, right? That the human mind has sort of two distinct ways that we process information. The first one being fast, automatic, um, right, instinctual, largely unconscious. And that's system one. And when, eight and these guys talk about intuitions, they're talking about system one. And then system two is the slower, rational, typically conscious um, type of thinking that you do. For example, when you're taking a college course, right, you're taking an exam, you're definitely in system two world, right? And if you're thinking carefully about a moral problem, you're two. So, you know, I don't know, 50 years ago, right, people were just assuming that morality was a system two sort of thing, right? That it was a rational, deliberative process. And more we're seeing evidence that system one is actually probably playing the primary role in how humans make their moral judgments. Right? They start with reaction, and then when they do, right, engage system two, it usually is just to justify the initial judgment. And so they've also sort of compared, you can sort of isolate the system one judgments in human subjects, compare those to uh, behavior in primates, right? And you can kind of see certain links and certain similarities, right? So in that way, they sort of settled on the five or possibly more moral foundations. Okay, so how does moral foundation theory differ from other theories, right? You want your theory to make different predictions and hopefully make more true predictions, right, than the other theories. So what's the difference and how can we tell them apart? Um, so obviously the main difference is the number of moral templates, right? So moral foundations theory says, well, there's at least five, there could be more. That's fine. And some researchers have argued that maybe there's a moral template for social justice concerns. Maybe moral templates are actually have to be more context specific, right? And so you have to make more finer uh, distinctions, right, according to context. That's all fine for moral foundations theory. They said, yeah, that might be true, right? They do clearly uh, differ from theories that posit only one moral foundation, and that is the one we saw, moral dyad theory. Right? That's in a major conflict with MFT here. Um, it's a moral monist theory as opposed to the moral pluralist theory, right? So, and again, the moral dyad theory was there's a single cognitive template for morals, and it is an intentional agent causing harm to a suffering patient, right? Okay, so Graham et al. Say, do concede, yeah, harm may in fact be the most important moral template. You're going to find it everywhere, right? In all cultures, some kind of prohibition on some kind of harm. Um, they just disagree that right morality can all moral judgments can be reduced to perceptions of harm. And we've seen the objections to this, right? Well, how is cheating a harm, right? How is certain like violating certain like uh, uh, religious uh, religious rules a harm, right? Eating roadkill, right? How is that harm? Um, and what the moral dyad theorist has to do is posit lots of different kinds of harm, right? Oh, yeah, the incest theory, the incest situation that Haidt describes, where he stipulates that they're not going to have any kids and there's no emotional damage or whatever. You know, the moral dyad theorist still has to say, well, we're projecting some kind of harm onto the situation, right? So they can do that all day long if they want. They can probably make up and find a harm. Um, and the question is that correct, right? Or are they just kind of diluting what they mean by harm to the point where it's not really a monist theory anymore, right? So, any good theory is going to make claims that are falsified, and moral foundations theory makes four of them, right? So they have this nativist claim. They claim that morality is innate. That might turn out to be false, right? They claim that this innate moral template is later shaped by culture and development. That could be false. They make this claim about intuitionism, right? That moral judgments are based on system one intuitive judgments. It could be false. We've seen evidence for all of these things, right? So, um, and in fact, most all the other theories kind of agree on one through three. Right? So it's actually four where we have the potential for deciding between the theories. Sometimes it's called a crucial experiment, right? If you can make a prediction that if your theory, right, prediction turns out true, your theory is supported, and at the same time, your competitor's theory is falsified, right? We call that a crucial experiment. With one experiment, you can support one theory and get rid of another. So if there's potential for that, right, for really distinguishing between the two theories and seeing which one is right, it's on this issue of pluralism. Um, so they want to present at least some evidence in support of. So, for example, take the purity impurity template, right? So purity violations, which are, for example, violations of sexual taboos, right? The incest example, or eating roadkill, those sort of things. Again, the monists, right, like Gray et al., are going to say, well, we perceive them as harmful, and even if they're not actually harmful, we import some harm, we project harm onto them. And in some of these articles, it's slightly annoying, right? So we're mostly reading sort of psychology articles, and some of them are great. I'm a philosopher by training, and I really appreciate how sort of careful philosophy articles are to make sure they support every claim. This section, I was a little disappointed that they just sort of throw out list a bunch of studies and don't really explain what they are, what role they're serving in their argument here. Um, but there are a few that they do explain a little more, right? So, but the general idea that they're trying to get at here is that some of the judgments, the types of moral judgments we observe in society, can't be explained by the care harm dimension alone. And we've already seen arguments sort, right? Many of you were making them in the discussion post. A lot of good arguments there. Um, so, right, we see a lot of opposition in our society, in many societies, right? The idea that some people judge sexuality to be wrong, some people judge euthanasia to be wrong, some people judge pornography to be wrong, even when it's people are consensually involved. Suicide, right? Even when the person chooses it, right? These are on the face of it, and of course, again, the moral diet theorists would say, no, there is harm, right? There is, some people might say there is harm in pornography, even if, there's consent, whatever, or maybe there could never really be truly consent. Um, Opposition to stem cell research, right, appears to be purely purity based. But at any point, they say, look at all these things, right, that you really have to tie yourself in a knot to find the harm, right? And if you just think in terms of like purity violations, it makes much more sense, right? Um, some people think that sex are impure. Some people think that harming yourself is a violation of, right, your soul, or like harms your soul, um, of sexual acts, right? So if you're in a culture with a strong sort of like sense of like certain things, certain sorts of actions are pure and impure, it really sort of like takes all these examples and makes sense of them a little bit better than trying to import harm into all of them, or find some sort of harm. Right? And here's some actual evidence, finally, right? Uh, if you, right, take conservatives and liberals and you talk to them about environmentalism, but you frame it differently, you'll get different responses from people. So conservatives, right, who are a candidate for people who are more concerned with purity violations, right, because they do seem to be opposed to many of these things on this list, right, homosexuality, euthanasia, suicide, pornography, right, to see these things as immoral. Um, so it's likely that conservatives, even in the U.S., are operating from a purity template, right? And if you frame environmentalism, which conservatives can kind of go either way. They do enjoy nature and hunting and stuff, but they also tend to be against environmental regulations. The more you frame environmentalism in terms of purity, right, keeping our streams clean, right, keeping nature pure, stuff like that, all of a sudden they express more support for environmentalism. And in fact, you can get conservatives same level of support for environmentalism as liberals if you frame the whole thing in terms of purity, right? So that does seem to be evidence that uh, there is a purity template at work here in conservative people in the U.S. More evidence, right? Purity information will increase the amount of praise or blame that we give to others, and it also affects how close you stand to others, right? So, if you tell somebody, again, they don't get into all the details. It would be nice, obviously we could chase down the articles and read the actual experiments, and sometimes it's useful. We will cover at least one of these experiments. Um, But you can imagine what sort of purity information you might say. You say, oh, yeah, this person, whatever. Okay, well, that's going to, people will tend to blame that person more harshly for something unrelated, right, than if they didn't have that information, and they won't even stand as close. Studies show that you can increase the severity of people's moral judgments against abortion by showing them graphic pictures of aborted fetuses, right? Going on there, probably, right, that you see something graphic and sort of disturbing, they'll feel disgust. Disgust is like the emotion that is related to these purity judgments, right? Um, and so, and in fact, as opposed to like anger, right? So typically when we perceive a harm, the emotion we feel is anger. And when we perceive a purity violation, the emotion we feel is disgust. Trigger disgust in people, they will tend to be uh, more against abortion than if you don't. Um, that suggests that perhaps some of abortion are operating from a purity template, not necessarily a harm template. Um, there's neural evidence that purity judgments are processed by a different part of the brain, right? So um, that would suggest that purity-based moral judgments are not just a kind of harm-based moral judgment, that there are two templates going on. There's two brain areas responsible for different types of moral judgments. Um, we also notice differences in brain activity, and this was mentioned in the mind perception article, right? So intentional versus accidental harms, right? So if I see someone intentionally kicking a puppy, a certain part of my brain will fire. Whereas if I see someone, accidentally tripping and kicking a puppy, part of my brain will fire. Um, but if we see purity violations, right? Somebody, I don't know, accidentally eats roadkill as opposed to intentionally eating roadkill, same part of the brain firing for that. Right? So again, it shows an asymmetry violations and harms, right? Suggesting that we've got two separate things going on. Right? Violations aren't just harm, but they're their own thing. And behaviorally, we can dissociate the harm and the purity. I can prime people, and that'll alter their purity judgments without altering their harm judgments, and vice versa. Priming someone just, well, we've already seen examples of priming. If you show someone a photo of an aborted fetus, right? That's a form of priming. If you just sort of, you know, give somebody something that's usually right, or it could be a word or a phrase that will get them thinking in a certain direction, right? Get their brains thinking in a certain direction. Uh, then I can prime you, right, to make uh, harsher judgments against someone on the basis of purity, right? But if I ask you to of harm, it won't change that. They're dissociable. I can vice versa. I can prime you to make different harm judgments without affecting your purity. It seems like the two can't be the same. It can't be that one is a subspecies of the other. They seem completely dissociable, separate, cognitive modules. Okay, so this is a relatively short essay, right? So they just sort of say, here's our theory, right, and here's some of our evidence for it. It'd be nice to see a little more evidence, I think. And, maybe it's their own fault for not explaining all of it that they cite. Uh, but here this is the last slide, and they're talking about how could where are we going next with this theory, right? How could we extend it? And then they admit like, we need more studies. They're mostly talking about purity, and they've posited, you know, five moral foundations. A fair amount of studies of the harm one, but we've still got three more in the middle there. Interesting to see some studies of, and they admit, yeah, we should do more studies, right? They do argue that uh, this evidence about purity does seem useful in understanding political polarization, right? There does seem to be something in conservative political values that have that are more motivated by purity judgments. For example, opposition to homosexuality, opposition to abortion, which we've seen can be primed by emotion of disgust, right, which is with purity. Um, but they also seem to care about loyalty, right, which is a distinct moral template, and they seem to care about authority, right? So those support the police, and that's another. So, right, many liberals found the election of Trump sort of inexplicable, right? Like, if you thought that Trump is probably not going to be a very good president, right? Because he didn't have a lot of experience or whatever, right? So people are like, why would they elect this person, right? He's just like a rich guy. Um, it might make more sense if you consider that Trump was appealing to specific moral foundations that motivate conservatives. So if in your campaign you're consistently hitting purity, loyalty, and authority, right? Then it does make, and those are sort of characteristic of conservatives' mind, right? Then it would make sense of why it would motivate conservatives. So moral foundations will also be useful in understanding morality in non-Western cultures, right? Because as we've seen, harm seems to be Western cultures definitely harm is like a big focus, and harm is big and important, right? Moral foundation in every culture, but there do seem to be other cultures where things like purity violations and authority uh, are sort of take are accentuated and are more important than they are in Western culture. And that can help us understand these cultural differences, right? When we talked about the moral dyad theory, and some of you brought up in the discussion all these cultural differences, couldn't really be explained just thinking about harm. Well, if we've got more moral foundations to work with, right, then maybe we can explain these cultural differences while still claiming that morality is at some level innate, right? We all have these basic five moral foundations, but if you grow up in a different culture, maybe two of them will come out a bit stronger than they would in the other culture, and so on. All right, well, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you next time.